The Confederate traitors, having engaged in exponential catastrophic threats to the United States, seek at its original form the lower levels or scam variants of the destruction of the United States by the dismantlement of the capacity of its commoners to survive on the basis of their own inferior incompetence. And to this degeneracy, you have the act of infection, which has generated the tremendous compounding function of the exponential catastrophic debts to the national function. And in this action of the national debt being the most tremendous threat to the United States that could possibly be imagined, has been targeted, and those who have systemically studied the vulnerabilities of the United States have masterfully manipulated the mechanism in order to facilitate the highest compounding injury, and to that extent engaged in these wars by espionage and fraud in order to exponentially compound the expansion of scam artists as an injury, as a mechanism of war by their phantom selves. And to this extent, you have the compounding function of the debts and the expansion of the social debts, which by definition David would have without the obstruction with his companies have engaged with heavily from the beginning in order to claim mass expansion as quickly and effectively as possible, sustaining himself off of these balances for the liabilities of the expansion early on in order to engage in the developments which would have settled itself. Now, to that extent, many of these expansion debts would have been crippling otherwise to many others, which would have been absorbed in order to have redeemed it as a sort of kinsman redeemer function where the liability would transfer in order to be absorbed into the central function, as the clients of David, who, being protected by the zombie insurance, would suffer the greater injury by its loss, would sell it to his companies with its liabilities, compounding the capacity of the total in favor of the preservation under that insurance, which would then systemically collect the collateral. And to this extent, David's companies would mostly be paying these liabilities from those defaults as it amasses extraordinary debts, which are preferable under that position, or it would not have co-signed it from the zombie insurance in the first place. To that end, you actively have the sustaining functions, which would have developed into maturity to have the complete and total domination of the key markets under David's control, which would then stabilize to the maturity and perfection of each of its architectural expansions. And to that end, you would have the fundamental core societies actively protected by these mechanisms, which then specializing in the subversion of the scam by the insurance would, by definition, find the scam artists to be themselves consumable products, as opposed to their scams, which would then be turned against themselves, and they would be devoured. As they progressively add additional structures and policies in order to engage in the function of the destruction of the United States by the replacement policy from the Confederates, increasing the Confederate slave raiders for the KKK contracts, such as, but is not limited to, the exponential expansion of the surveillance powers, which engages in the function of the crippling uh, of each of the vulnerabilities which are exploited by the enemies of the United States. To this extent, they, having studied all of the functions of the American strengths, have sought to cripple them and have used extraordinary resources from the American government in order to cripple the American government and its supporting society. To this end, you actively have the function of national debt skyrocketing exponentially as a mechanism of war by the white supremacist communists against the United States in hyper-centralizing the monopolies which have engaged in the function of the new fascism, which then engage in the lobbying activities which materializes the function of the war efforts, having absorbed the hyper-powerful, have engaged in the most difficult mechanisms as the parasite extorts the host into collapse and then devours and replaces it. And this would have actively been countered in the struggle, according to Lindsey Graham's estimate of the Confederates' eradication of the United States by David's networks, which includes the function of the bonus credit score, which would have actively been infused into the American policy, as David is the premier political influence, according to the legal original structure for the American loyal constitutional republic. To this end, you maintain these activities, which facilitate alternative mechanisms in order to engage in the expansion without the direct use of money itself. To that end, all inflationary functions can be subverted by the destruction of the currency, which is then devoured by the function of increasing the government's records of the credit score as founded on the bonus credit score algorithm for the government's version to be conducted by itself, and to that end would facilitate the alternative mechanism for all of the advantages that are just as good as money. To that extent, it would lower the function of the inflation, and thus the fact that the inflation cannot be countered directly by direct action without the use of extreme force, it would necessarily have to happen. And to the extent that it has to happen, you would have to materialize the action of these disillusionment mechanisms. And to that end, you would have the purchase of the credit score function, which would then destroy the currency that is not specifically used to amplify the function of the client's network, such as the disillusionment of its debts, and thus the settlement of the liabilities and the disillusionment of the inflation allows for the resettlement of the action as it is compromised um, by the terrorist and counter attacked by the defense mechanisms. The active ebb and flow function from their contests would facilitate the obligation for the Confederates to engage in the hot war, as they have conceded, according to their own records, of the superiority of David Bowles and his systems as compared to their own inferior functions, as they are less capable predators, as David is a defense mechanism, and therefore national security would have been sustained. And thus, the mechanism, if one could theoretically provide the legal mechanism of a time machine, the thing to do is to force the duel. The thing to do then is to eradicate the Confederates. The thing to do is then to vet and de-radicalize all military forces. And the thing to do is to send them back in time and exterminate all mechanisms of the war on David. And in the action that they do so, they simply have to tolerate the arbitrary nature of random offenses and criminal intentions and trust the system of government to sustain itself with all of those mechanisms, as the eradication of the WaronDavid is the barring of the sedition against the government. And with the barring of the sedition against the government, you actively maintain and mature the function of it proving its viability of survival as a legitimate government structure, which is superior in strategy to the function of just going back in time and taking over everything and starting from scratch, as that would not solve the problem of how to functionally have a government. You have to have the evolution of the natural engagement of the government without these major injuries to the whole of its system, which is the only way to test it, which is the only way to validate it, and all other ways becomes a mechanism of a permanent time war, as the mechanism of going back generates greed in viabilities of competitors, which then engage in the time machine use, which then engage in the extraordinary contests throughout time and space, creating catastrophic injuries that cannot be calculated, and thus the function, if truly it did exist, must be limited to these premier, specific, exclusive functions, that it might not be overused and inflated and thus become common by virtue of its use. So again, you have to understand the function of their strip mining, and the counteraction of the security requires the function of extreme calculations of network interests, and the network interests facilitate the guidance concerning what the loans would be, which would then digest the function upon collapse if the party is not able to sustain their part of the market, as the anti-monopoly activity is actively seeking to uh, exchange all of the services and functions away from itself, to broker it away from itself, and engage in the least amount of risky, arbitrary primary gains in favor of steady, consistent, competent work, which would then be something that would not directly be recognizable. But to this extent, the Confederates have engaged in, take the lumber industry, for instance, or the strip mining function of the uh, normal mining functions. The activity of their function leaves the land absolutely barren. In these activities which have been promoted, the complete eradication, so those that engage in the deal with the devil in order to gain advantages from the white supremacists for the communism, have asserted themselves as superior according to this terrorism for the Faustian deal, where they pretend to be important by the black market's contracting of the KKK surveillance contracts, which materializes their capacity to the various abuses arbitrarily for their specific entertainment, which is engaged in the widespread mafia function of terrorism in the United States and its allies. So, thus, the counteraction must likewise engage in the disillusionment of those activities, which engages in the more benign resources without the malice, which then secures against the malice, which then breaks the malice, which then takes the properties derived by the scam artists in their contracts, which they accept in order to progress their fraud. To this extent, the destruction of the land by virtue of supporting evil is then countered by the building of the land in order to have supported the network interest, which requires the function of the sustained ecosystem, which is a network interest of permanent survival. And to the extent that this is generated, you have the historic conflicts from their estimate, which would have facilitated the benign version of what they believed David's activities to be, which would require the underground bases fundamentally for the intelligence oversight function, which would then facilitate its um, all of its missions from this, at which point their engagement of destruction would seek to target the activity of any of the underground bases in favor of creating mining functions to completely strip out all of those particular functions if they ever gained an advantage against it. To that end, any of its collapses would then be a complete gutting of the function of the security. And to this end, that would have contributed from their treaties on the basis of when each of them would have wanted the treaties, which would go into a historic function exponentially, as each of the deals would have to be offered to them according to the projection of the prophecy, and thus the function of their acceptance creates the stabilizing of the structure, which then materializes the operation, which then generates the underground basis, which then generates the function of the status quo, which then engages in the expansion of the normal economic exchanges to the on top of the ground parts of society where each of the treaties would have manufactured their own definition for the exchanges of services, having normalized the relationships which they believe is fundamental to the protection of international law and the laws of war, which would be sustained by David's nation, mediated by these functions, which are actively engaged in the contest against the wizard communists, who, for now, then, we could maybe in the future engage in the past fights, materializing the function of the conflicts from the hyper exaggerated hot war down into the subtle, unseen conflicts amongst spies, which then engage in the contest, specifically in the most undisturbing mechanism as viably possible, while furiously acting against each other according to proxy wars of subtlety. Now, if the function is historically, then the action of history has certified itself in favor of the compounding of gold, and the action of having compounded in gold and silver and other common coins and functions would systemically be an active function. But to the extent that it becomes a historic expansion, then the function becomes more imbued upon the arts and histories and preservations of records, such as the eradicated religions and histories of peoples which have been conquered and thus erased from that history, which requires the existence of this in order to engage in the activity of the preservation of the culture, which then would be specifically defended in the mechanism of their own society for the profits under the treaties maintained for the express purposes defined in their own policies with their treaties with David Bowles' kingdom